Harry Potter, Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 15, The Hogwarts High Inquisitor. They had expected to have to comb Hermione's Daily Prophet carefully the next morning to find an article Percy had mentioned in his letter. However, the departing delivery owl had barely cleared the top of the milk jug when Hermione let out a huge gasp and flattened the newspaper to reveal a large photograph of Dolores Umbridge, smiling widely and blinking slowly from beneath the headline. Ministry seeks educational reform. Dolores Umbridge appointed first ever High Inquisitor. Umbridge? High Inquisitor? Said Harry darkly, his half-eaten piece of toast slipping from his fingers. What does that mean? Hermione read out loud. In a surprise move last night, the Ministry of Magic passed a new legislation giving itself an unprecedented level of control at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The Ministry has been growing uneasy about the going-ons at Hogwarts for some time, said Junior Assistant to the Minister, Percy Weasley. He is now responding to concerns voiced by anxious parents who feel that the school may be moving in a direction they do not approve of. This is not the first time in recent weeks that the minister, Cornelius Fudge, has used new laws to effect improvements at the Wizarding School. As recently as the 30th of August, Educational Decree number 22 was passed to ensure that, in the event that the current headmaster being unable to provide a candidate for a teaching post, the ministry should select and appoint a person. That's how Dolores Umbridge came to be appointed to the teaching staff at Hogwarts, said Weasley last night. Dumbledore couldn't find anyone, so the minister put in Umbridge, and of course she's been an immediate success. She's been a what? Said Harry loudly. Wait, there's more, said Hermione grimly. An immediate success, total revolutionizing the teaching of Defense Against the Dark Arts and providing the minister with on-the-ground feedback of what's really been happening at Hogwarts. It is the last function that the ministry has now formalized with the passing of Education Decree number 23, which creates a new position at Hogwarts High Inquisitor. This is an exciting new phase in the minister's plans to get to grips with what some are calling the falling standards at Hogwarts, said Weasley. The High Inquisitor have powers to inspect her fellow educators and make sure that they're coming up to scratch. Professor Umbridge has been offered this position in addition to her own teaching post, and we are delighted to say that she has accepted. The ministry new moves have received enthusiastic support from the parents and students at Hogwarts. I feel much easier in my mind now that I know Dumbledore is being subject to fair and objective evaluation, said Lucius Malfoy, 41, speaking from his Wiltshire mansion last night. Many of us with our children's best interests at heart have been concerned with some of Dumbledore's eccentric decisions in the last few years and are glad to know that the ministry is keeping an eye on the situation. Among those eccentric decisions are undoubtedly the controversial staff appointments previously described in this newspaper, which have included the employment of a werewolf, Remus Lupin, half-giant, Rubeus Hagrid, and delusional ex-Auror, Mad-Eye Moody. Rumors abound, of course, that Albus Dumbledore, once supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards and chief warlock of the Wizengamot, is no longer up to task of managing the prestigious school at Hogwarts. I think the appointment of the Inquisitor is the first step towards ensuring that Hogwarts has a headmaster in whom we can all repose our confidence, said the minister last night. Wizengamot elders Gorilda Marchbanks and Tiberius Ogden have resigned in protest at the introduction of the power of Inquisitor of Hogwarts. Hogwarts is a school, not an outpost of Cornelius Fudge's office, said Madame Marchbanks. This is a further disgusting attempt to discredit Albus Dumbledore. For full account on Madame Marchbanks' alleged links to supervise the goblin groups, turn to page 17. Hermione finished reading and looked across the table at the two others. Now we know how we ended up with Umbridge. Fudge passed this educational decree and forced her on us. And now he's given her the power to inspect our teachers. Hermione was breathing fast and her eyes were very bright. I can't believe this. This is outrageous. I know it is, said Harry. He looked down at his right hand clutched on the tabletop and saw the faint white outline of the letters Umbridge had forced him to cut into his skin. But a grin was unfurling on Ron's face. What? Said Ron and Hermione together, staring at him. Oh, I can't wait to see McGonagall inspected, said Ron happily. Umbridge won't know what hit her. Well, come on, said Hermione, jumping up. We'd better get going. If she's inspecting Ben's class, we don't want to be late. But Professor Umbridge was not expecting their history of magic lesson, which was just as dull as the previous Monday. Nor was she in Snape's dungeon when they arrived for double potions, where Harry's Moonstone essay was handed back to him with a large, spiky black D scrawled in the upper corner. I have awarded you the grades in which you received if you presented this work in your OWL, said Snape with a smirk, and he swept among them, passing back their homework. This should give you a realistic idea of what to expect in your examinations. Snape reached the front of the class and turned to face them. The general standard of this homework was abysmal. Most of you would have failed had it not been have this been your examinations. I expect to see a great deal more effort for the week's essays on various varieties of venom antidotes, or I shall have to start handing our detentions to those dunces who get a D. He smirked as Malfoy snickered and said, in a carrying whisper, Some people got a D? Harry realized that Hermione was looking sideways to see what grade he had received. He slipped his Moonstone essay back into his bag as quickly as possible, feeling that he could rather keep that information private. Determined not to give Snape an excuse to fail him this lesson, Harry read and reread every line of the instructions on the blackboard at least 3 times before acting upon them. His strengthening solution was not precisely the clear turquoise shade of Hermione's, but it was at least blue rather than pink like Neville's, and he delivered a flask of it to Snape's desk at the end of the lesson with a feeling of mingled defiance and relief. Well, that wasn't as bad as last week's, was it? Said Hermione as she climbed the steps out of the dungeon and made their way across the entrance hall towards lunch. And that homework didn't go badly either, did it? Well, neither Ron nor Harry answered. She pressed on. I mean, all right, I didn't expect the top grade. Not if we're marking OWL standards. But a passing is quite encouraging at this stage, wouldn't you say? Harry made a noncommittal noise in his throat. Of course, a lot can happen between now and the examinations. We've got plenty of time to improve, but the grades we're getting now are just sort of a baseline, aren't they? Something we could build on. They sat together at the Gryffindor table. Obviously, I had been thrilled if I'd gotten an O. Hermione, said Ron sharply, if you want to know what grades we got, ask. Well, if you want to tell me. I got a P, said Ron, ladling soup into his bowl. Happy? Well, that's nothing to be ashamed of, said Fred, who had just arrived at the table with George and Lee, and was sitting down on Harry's right. Nothing wrong with a good, healthy P. But, said Hermione, doesn't P stand for poor? Yeah, said Lee Jordan. Still, better than a D, isn't it? Dreadful. Harry felt his face grow warm and faked a small coughing fit over his roll. When he emerged from this, he was sorry to find that Hermione was still in full flow about OWL grades. So, top grades O for outstanding, she was saying. And then there's A. Nope. E, George corrected her. E for exceeds expectations. And I've always thought Fred and I should have gotten an E in everything, because we exceeded expectations just by turning up for the exams. They all laughed except Hermione, who plowed on. So after E is A for acceptable. And that's the last passing grade, isn't it? Yep, said Fred, dunking an entire roll in his soup, transferring it to his mouth, and swallowing it whole. Then you get P for poor, said Ron, raising his hands in mock celebration, and D for dreadful. And then T, George reminded him. T? Asked Hermione, looking appalled. Even lower than a D? What does T stand for? Troll, said George promptly. Harry laughed again, though he was not sure whether or not George was joking. He imagined trying to conceal to Hermione that he had gotten a T in all of his OWLs, immediately resolved to work harder from now on. You lot had an inspection lesson yet? Fred asked them. No, said Hermione at once. Have you? Just now, before lunch, said George. Charms. What was it like? Harry and Hermione asked together. Fred shrugged. Not that bad. Umbridge just lurked in the corner, making notes on a clipboard. You know what Flitwick's like. He treated her as a guest. Didn't seem to bother him at all. He didn't say much. Asked Alicia a couple of questions about what the classes are normally like, and Alicia told her that they were really good. That was it. I can't see old Flitwick getting marked down, said George. He usually gets everyone through their exams all right. Who've you got this afternoon? Fred asked Harry. Trelawney. A T if I've ever saw one. And Umbridge herself. Well, be a good boy and keep your temper with Umbridge today, said George. Angelina, do her nut if you miss any more Quidditch practices. And Harry did not have to wait for Defense Against the Dark Arts to meet Professor Umbridge. He was pulling out of his dreamy diary in a seat at the very back of the shadowy divination room when Ron elbowed him in the ribs and looked around. He saw Professor Umbridge emerging through the trap door of the floor. The class, which had been talking cheerily, fell silent at once. The abrupt fall in the noise level made Professor Trelawney, I always have a hard time with their name, guys, who had been wafting about handing out copies of the Dream Oracle, look around. Good afternoon, Professor Trelawney, said Professor Umbridge with her wide smile. You received my note, I trust, giving you the time and date of our inspection? Professor Trelawney nodded curtly and, looking very disgruntled, turned her back to Professor Umbridge and continued to give out books. Still smiling, Professor Umbridge grasped the back of the nearest armchair and pulled it in front of the class, so that it was a few inches behind Professor Trelawney's seat, and then sat down, took her clipboard from her flowy bag, and looked up expectantly, waiting for the class to begin. Professor Trelawney pulled her shawl tight about her and slightly trembling hands and surveyed the class through her hugely magnificent lenses. We shall be continuing our study of prophetic dream today, she said in a brave attempt at her usual mystic tones, though her voice shook slightly. Divide into pairs, please, and interpret each other's latest nighttime visions with the aid of the oracle. She made it through to sweep back to her seat, saw Professor Umbridge sitting right behind it, and immediately veered left towards Parvati and Lavender, who were already deep in discussions about Parvati's most recent dream. Harry opened a copy of the Dream Oracle, watching Umbridge covertly. She was already making notes on her clipboard. After a few minutes, she got to her feet and began to pace the room in Trelawney's wake, listening to her conversations with students and posing questions here and there. Harry bent his head hurriedly over his book. Think of a dream, quick, he told Ron, in case the old toad comes our way. I did it last time, Ron protested. It's your turn. You tell me one. Oh, I don't know, said Harry desperately, who could not remember dreaming anything over the last few days. Let's say I dreamed I was drowning Snape in a cauldron. Yeah, that'll do. Ron chortled as he opened his dream oracle. Okay, we've got to add your age and date. You had the dream, number of letters in the subject. What should that be? Drowning, cauldron, or Snape? It doesn't matter, pick any of them, said Harry. Chancing a glance around him, Professor Umbridge was now standing at Professor Trelawney's shoulder making notes while the divination teacher questioned Neville about his dream diary. What night did you dream this again? Ron muttered, immersed in these calculations. I don't know, last night, whenever you like, Harry told him, trying to listen to what Umbridge was saying to Professor Trelawney. They were only a table away from him and Ron now. Professor Umbridge was making another note on her clipboard, and Professor Trelawney was looking extremely put out. Now, said Professor Umbridge, looking up at Trelawney, you've been in this post for how long exactly? Professor Trelawney scowled at her, arms crossed, shoulders hunched, as though wishing to protect herself as much as possible from the indignity of this inspection. After a slight pause in which she seemed to decide that the question was not so offensive that she could reasonably ignore it, she said in a deeply resentful tone, Nearly 16 years. Quite a period, said Professor Umbridge, making a note on her clipboard. So it was Professor Dumbledore who appointed you? That's right, said Professor Trelawney shortly. Professor Umbridge made another note. And you are great-granddaughter of the celebrated cheer Cassandra Trelawney? Yes, said Professor Trelawney, holding her head a little higher. Another note on her clipboard. But I think, correct me if I'm mistaken, that you are the first in your family since Cassandra to be possessed with second sight? These things often skip 3 generations, Professor Trelawney said. Professor Umbridge's toad-like smile widened. Of course, she said sweetly, making yet another note. Well, if you could just predict something for me then. And she looked up inquiringly, still smiling. Professor Trelawney stiffened as though unable to believe her ears. I don't understand you, she said, clutching convulsively at the shawl around her scrawny neck. I'd like you to make a prediction for me, said Professor Umbridge very clearly. Harry and Ron were not the only people now watching and listening sneakily from behind their books. Most of the class were staring, transfixed, at Professor Trelawney as she drew herself up to her full height, her beads and bangles clicking. The inner eye does not see upon command, she said, scandalous tones. I see, said Professor Umbridge softly, yet making another note in her clipboard. But wait, said Professor Trelawney suddenly, in attempt to her usual ethereal voice, though the mystical effort was ruined somewhat by the way she was shaking with anger. I think I do see something. Something that concerns you. Why, I sense something dark, some grave peril. Professor Trelawney pointed a shaking finger at Professor Umbridge, who continued to smile blandly at her, eyebrows raised. I'm afraid. I'm afraid that you are in grave danger, said Professor Trelawney, finished dramatically. There was a pause. Professor Umbridge eyebrows were raised. Right, she said softly, scribbling on her clipboard once more. Well, if that's really the best you can do. She turned away, leaving Professor Trelawney standing rooted to the spot, her chest heaving. Harry caught Ron's eye and knew that Ron was thinking exactly the same as he was. They both knew that Professor Trelawney was an old fraud. But, on the other hand, they loathed Umbridge so much that they felt very much on Trelawney's side, until she swooped down on them a second later, that is. Well, she said, snapping her fingers under Harry's nose, uncharacteristically brisk. Let's let me see what the start you've made on your dream diary, please. And by the time she had interpreted Harry's dream at the top of her voice, all of which, even the ones that involved eating porridge, apparently foreboded a gruesome and early death, he was feeling much less sympathetic towards her. All the while, Professor Umbridge stood a few feet away making notes on the clipboard, and when the bell rang, she decided that the silver ladder first. She descended the silver ladder first and was waiting for them when they reached the Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson 10 minutes later. She was humming and smiling to herself when they entered the room. Harry and Ron told Hermione, who had been in Arthmancy, exactly what had happened in divination while they all took out their copies of defensive magical theory. But before Hermione could ask any questions, Professor Umbridge had called them all to order, and silence fell.